so many people, I think, don't have a fucking clue what they're talking about. We barely have a clue what we're talking about. And even then, like...
I think we've got a clue between us.
Yeah, with maybe one clue.
My primary takeaway is that it got me really fired up to read the Lasordo. We just got to figure out a way to do that.
Yeah, I agree. The Lasordo, for sure. There were a lot of sources here. I actually consulted some additional sources so I could talk about the Soviet economy today.
Nice.
Not the economy, their political structure. Because so much of this has to do with the party.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times he just says, like, the party structure will do it, you know? And it's like, well, what actually was the Soviet structure, you know? And I think that the historical context around this book is important because it's a series of lectures that have been transcribed into one book. But in 1924, Stalin hadn't consolidated his power. They're still operating under the Leninist model, under the Leninist constitution, under a Leninist economy. The new economic program is there, it's essentially reintroducing free market principles into the Soviet economy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that it's really interesting just the time period that this work took place in.
For sure.
And I think that that's really a big part of it because, you know, at the time, I actually don't know what the structure is like under the Stalin constitution, but that came in the 30s. Stalin didn't make the call to collectivize the agricultural system until 1928. So this was even before that. You know, they were just coming out of a period of civil war where they had put in war communism. They had instituted war communism, and it like
sounds hard as fuck.
I know, but it put a serious strain on. I mean, it put a serious strain on their legitimacy, even because they were like, all of the food needs to come to us for the purposes of one, fighting the war, and then we'll deal with everything else after that.
Yeah.
You know, the survival of communism as we know it relies on this, and so that makes sense. It's a huge debate still. I have only dipped my toe into it, and I really, it's like, oh god, that sounds
It is one
terrible.
of the things that comes up every time you talk about Stalin, though.
It's true. That's the thing, is that he's literally acting in reaction, and it's not reaction. I mean, they're working around very significant events. You know, I mean, in 1922 there was a fucking famine, right? And so the new economic policy is literally, I think if they didn't have to do it, they wouldn't have done it. You know what I mean? Because I think, it is a step back towards capitalism, and many of the Bolsheviks were willing to criticize that. And it's just a lot. It's a doozy of a time, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had that conversation with my coworker the other day because I propagandize a lot, basically. And he was like, I went and watched a documentary, and we talked about Stalin. I was like, it's not that he was a good guy, but it's just that he wasn't as bad as you'll probably read about.
I feel absolutely certain. He is the most propagandized man in history.
Absolutely. It's pretty insane. It's to the point where it's hard for me to tell what is true, you know?
Yeah.
And I haven't done the deep research yet, you know, to really talk about Stalin with any certainty, like ultimate confidence in terms of like the actual historical record. But from what I have read, it just seems like a bitch. I mean, imagine it, you know, I hate to be like, oh, put yourselves in that situation. What would you do? But like, that's ultimately what it is. You've just taken control of 150 million people, all desperately begging to be fed. You have proclaimed pure equality, pure utopia. You know, you have said, we're fighting for this ideal. We're going to build socialism. What are you doing? What do you do? That's a crazy question to try to answer. And to see their earnest attempt, I think, is like really something.
Yeah.
That's part of why I like this so much, you know. Not necessarily this piece specifically, but it's part of why I like reading this history especially.
Yeah, I think placing this work in the context of the time in which it was written is really important, and it's really hard to read any of this stuff ahistorically.
Yeah.
And it's really hard, especially with Stalin, to listen to criticisms of Stalin ahistorically. Like you were saying, like circumstances created the need to make decisions that likely wouldn't have been made or would have been made very differently otherwise, that remain some of the most highly debated criticisms of his tenure, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what the fuck are you supposed to do?
Yeah, I mean, and it's not that we're not going to criticize Stalin, you know? There's still a lot of fucking stupid stuff that Stalin did for one reason or another. Mm-hmm. I could talk all day about the crazy ethnic deportations he did. I mean, God.
I have purges as one of the things to talk about.
Purge, dude. He's so straight up with it. We'll talk about purges, right? But, like, interesting that every time someone was purged in the Soviet Union, it was with a bullet. It wasn't just...
Or an ice pick.
No, sorry. Forgive me. That's an overgeneralization. Many people, like a swath of the Mensheviks, were excluded from public service, and that was an acceptable purge, okay? Mm-hmm. But in the great purges, it was always with a gun. All right? What's up with that, Joe? So, we'll get to it. Anyway, hey.
Hello.
Welcome to Left Unread.
Yes, welcome. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
Yes, we're simply two guys in search of innovative new forms of organization.
And in that spirit...
Speaking of innovative forms of new organization, we're here today to talk a little bit about the capital P party.
Yes, we have read The Foundations of Leninism by Joseph Stalin.
Yeah, we've talked about Stalin before. We had previously read Historical and Dialectical Materialism. Maybe It's Dialectical and Historical Materialism. It's in the same book, actually. We're reading from The Essential Stalin, Major Theoretical Writings, 1905 to 52, edited and with an introduction by Bruce Franklin. Yeah, so I wrote a little introduction about Stalin in 1924. By 1924, Stalin had already been placed into a high position by the man himself, Lenin. After being named General Secretary, Stalin was the main connection between Lenin and the Central Council after Lenin suffered a stroke. Throughout 1924, Stalin consolidated his power. That's after Lenin died, I should say. Stalin consolidated his power, ousting first Trotsky and then his original coalition members, Zinoviev and Kamenev, to centralize himself at the head of the Union. Caught at the crossroads of Lenin's new economic policy, Stalin attempted to use the iron discipline of the party to forge a new kind of society. In Foundations of Leninism, Stalin transcribes 9 lectures delivered to new cadre into his first published work since the 1917 revolution, concentrating his knowledge of Lenin into one decisive piece of theory.
Nice. I didn't know this was his first work since the revolution.
According to Wikipedia, at least.
That's cool. I will note your mention of Trotsky being the first one that gets ousted. I don't know if you noticed, the very start of this gives us a footnote about Trotsky, which I just think is important to read. In 1923, Lenin became gravely ill. Immediately, Trotsky, who had come over to the Bolsheviks at the moment of victory of the 1917 revolution, began to organize opposition groups within the party. And it goes on, but I will say the more and more I learn about the USSR, about the 1905 revolution, the 1917 revolutions, the more I understand why Trotsky gets so much hate.
Yeah, it's just whiny, man. The one thing I will say is that we talked a little bit about Lenin's testament before, his last will.
Yeah.
But I don't feel like doing any sleuthery into that, Is it legitimate? Is it not? How much does it reflect Lenin's will? Clearly, Lenin trusted Stalin enough to name him General Secretary beforehand, although there's some historical note that he disapproved of his behavior. When I said in the introduction there that he was the connection, it's because Lenin was in like a sick home, He was in like the dacha, in the woods or whatever. He was like, he was in recovery, He was in the little White House, like FDR, and then he fucking died. All right, but Stalin was the guy, and so they had a lot of theoretical debates there. Mm-hmm. There's even a famous example where Stalin is rude to Lenin's wife, and Lenin writes him that letter and is like, "Don't you ever fucking talk shit about my wife again."
I have to say something. I didn't particularly like that joke. I love my wife. I respect her. And before I tell a joke, I like to ask myself, if she was sitting right next to me, would I tell this joke? That comment crossed the line. I don't think it's very funny.
Good for you, Lenin.
Yeah, he's like, you're cut if this is the case. It's great. So shout outs to that. But it's odd to think that there's 3 years of tightly knit cooperation between Stalin and Lenin, and then Lenin's testament comes out and just says, actually, I think Trotsky might be the best guy for the job. Stalin is rude and pigheaded and, maybe should even be removed from being the general secretary or whatever. And it's like,
yeah,
that's so interesting,
Feels a little suspect.
Well, in the same way, Mao, when he died, his successor, I don't want to mispronounce it. I think it's Hua Guofeng, if I'm not mistaken. Let me make sure. But he gets a handwritten note from Mao that says, when you're in charge, I'm at ease. And it's, scrawled, this is a man on his deathbed,
give me a pencil.
Yeah, exactly, And so, there's that same kind of question of, how legitimate is this really, Yeah. I mean, by the time Lenin died, he couldn't speak. He was paralyzed in half of his body, basically.
Yeah, he had a stroke, right?
Yeah, he had multiple strokes, if I'm not mistaken. And the first one happened in 1922 or 23. So there was some time where he was, not incapacitated, but he was still deeply active in politics, but he was basically not even kept away. He was kept away for his own health, but he was ailing, okay?
Yeah.
It was not pretty. So yeah, that being said though, we didn't read this book to legitimize Stalin necessarily. I think the reason we read it for, the reason I wanted to read this specifically is because I still have questions about the party, man. The party is really an issue for me still, because there is no organization in the modern day aside from what are ostensibly parties. Is that the way to get this thing done? That's still a question for me. We're 31 episodes into this, John, and I still haven't figured that out. That's the thing.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think we've gotten some criticism as of late with the way that we talk about the party, specifically Lenin's conception of the party. And I think maybe we've presented ourselves on the show as being much more ironclad in our dedication to the Leninist model. But largely, I think it's because, at least because of what we've read so far or whatever, I see no better solution yet. But as we've been reading things and getting this criticism and talking about it a little bit more with comrades, it's made us want to know more about, like, where do we actually stand on this? How do we actually feel about it? And get a little bit more of a theoretical foundation to continue developing that question.
Yeah, because the discomfort's always been there. I mean, I'm just thinking back to when we had originally talked about the parties on, like, the first couple of episodes, and it's just, like, there's a lot of things, like, we're all aware of the historical record, at least to some extent, so it's like, how do you deal with those kinds of issues, all right, if we're going to follow the same path? Especially when we're talking about the things that Stalin did, like, the things that Stalin did that were shit, right? He did those for a reason, and part of that reason is because he had the iron discipline of the party at his disposal, right? How much of that is a factor, right? Is the failure, in whatever air quotes you want to put on it, on any side of the ideological spectrum, the failure of the Soviet Union, for whatever you think the reason is it because of the party? Right? Is it because of the structure of the organization in which it was founded upon?
Well, and there's also a really uncomfortable question in that regard, which is also going to bring up the question of the purges and things like that, which is like, what is the appropriate response to revisionism, to tailism, to opportunism that you see happening with the party structure? How much of that can the party withstand? How much of that should the party withstand? And looking at the history of Russia, of USSR, is another really good way to, like, kind of analyze that question. How much of what happened there is a failure of the party? How much of it is a failure of the party in that the party could not meet its ends?
Yeah.
Versus the party being exploited, manipulated, or changed through revisionists.
Even the idea of a party built on the foundations of Tsarist Russia being unable to overcome some of those, I almost said traditions there, but, there's clearly things that stayed into the Soviet Union that are held over from the Tsarist system, right? And maybe what I'm saying is, like, the state machine wasn't necessarily as smashed as much as Lenin might have said in his texts. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, it's a bit of a weird thing because I don't want it to be like, ugh, authoritarianism is baked into the Russian culture. Like, that's not at all what I'm saying. Like, people say that on the internet, and it's like, you're a fucking crazy racist, apparently.
That's wild,
but the secret police, right? The NKVD, which people consider to be the secret police, it's People's Commissars, whatever you want to call it, right? It's almost a direct descendant, a spiritual successor to the Okhrana. I mean, the Tsarist secret police that were already there. So there's a lot of things that are held over from the Tsarist period in Russia that maybe the party was unable to overcome. That's the crazy thing to me, is that there are certainly discontents with the party that I think are valid. To what extent are some of those just in the historical context of Russia, of the USSR, right? If we were to use the same structures in a different scenario, would they still end up with the same results? You know what I mean? Where's the root of the problem, if there is a problem at all? I guess that's always the question, right? And if the problem is with the party, then what's the alternative?
That is still a question I very much welcome responses to. If the problem is the party, what's the alternative?
Yeah. You can let us know at leftandredfeedback@gmail.com. I'll say that now.
Please do.
Let's crack into this thing.
Yeah, how do you want to get into it? I have some things, but we can do it however you like.
I don't know. What do you have?
I'm an educator at heart, I guess. I feel like if we're reading a text called The Foundations of Leninism, the first thing we need to do, and certainly the first thing Stalin does, is establish what Leninism is. And I think he makes a really interesting argument that I'd never really, I guess I believed, but I had never really seen articulated in this way.
Okay.
So I would start, and this is a quirk of the way that he approaches all of these, maybe because they were lectures, but he has a tendency to open with a question and then answer the question, often with a list. And then often that list, each item has a sub-list. It gets a little annoying, but he opens the essay on 102. He asks, and so what is Leninism? And then he spends a few paragraphs articulating that. I think he gives us 3 definitions, ultimately. He starts right after asking the question by saying, some may say that Leninism is the application of Marxism to the conditions that are peculiar to the situation in Russia. He says, we know, however, that Leninism is not merely a Russian but an international phenomenon rooted in the whole international development, so that definition doesn't suffice. To Joseph.
Sure.
He continues on. Others say that Leninism is the revival of the revolutionary elements of Marxism of the 40s of the 19th century, and he goes on to say Lenin did indeed restore the revolutionary content of Marxism, which had been suppressed by the opportunists of the Second International, getting his first of very, very many jabs at the Second International.
Totally. Rightfully so.
Yeah, but he thinks that also is maybe a little insufficient, because he closes that paragraph, we're at the top of 103 now, by saying Leninism not only restored Marxism, but also took a step forward, developing Marxism further under the new conditions of capitalism and the class struggles of the proletariat. So then he finally tells us what he thinks Leninism is. Leninism is Marxism of the era of imperialism and the proletarian revolution.
Yeah.
To be more exact, it's the theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution in general, the theory and tactics of the dictatorship of the proletariat in particular. And this next part is what really stood out to me, where he writes, Marx and Engels pursued their activities in the pre-revolutionary period. We have the proletarian revolution in mind, when developed imperialism did not yet exist. In the periods of the proletarians' preparation for revolution, in the period when the proletarian revolution was not yet an immediate practical inevitability. So this really stood out to me because it's like the question is, well, why do you need Leninism if you have Marxism? And his answer to that is because Marxism is a pre-revolutionary ideology. It needed further development because imperialism had not become fully formed yet in Marx's time.
Yeah.
So he is kind of calling Lenin Marx plus, I guess. He's saying that, like,
well, sure,
orthodox Marxism will always fall short because it's always making a prediction, not an analysis.
Yeah.
I guess I'd always thought of that, and you know, MLs will always talk about Leninism as the natural development under scientific socialism of Marxist ideology. And it's like, okay, yeah, sure, but this is an articulation of exactly why that was necessary. And I don't know, for some reason it just clicked for me.
Yeah, well, I think it's totally valid, especially in the way that people even think about Maoism, you know, and I think that you can see the trappings of that kind of internationalism here when Stalin talks about the necessity of blending the revolutionary struggle with the liberation movement as well. Maoism is almost in that same sense, in a parallel sense, I should say. Marxism adapted to that era where we're moving into something that's post-colonial, right? Something that's maybe neo-imperialist. It's the adaptation of Marxist and Leninist principles. You can even see it later in some of like the steps for winning the revolution that Lenin lays out. You know, like to always push the advance, those kinds of things. You can see that same kind of development because those same steps are still present in Mao, just in a different context, you know, a context within this like massive populace in the countryside. And so I think it's really interesting, but it also really begs the question as to like, not that I'm trying to put today into an era specifically, like the, you know, we're in imperialism, we're in neo-imperialism or whatever, but like in what way does theory still need to be adapted to the modern situation, you know? I mean, we're looking at this, the foundation of Leninism. Leninism worked within the context of its era. It's the application of the principles to that era. You know, how can we, I guess I'm asking, you know, what's the analysis of the current era, right? I don't think we're still operating in imperialism, obviously. I think we're into something crazier than that. And if people have tried to answer that question, I mean, like, I think of Techno-Feudalism by Yanis Varoufakis. I haven't read it, obviously, but where are we at? How best can these principles still be applied to the modern society? Because even though there's definite parallels in what we read here in Foundations of Leninism, I'm thinking about the peasantry, really.
Yeah.
It's like, how are those applied to today, you know? And that's always the question when we read these, especially Russian texts, I feel.
I think that's an underlying interrogative ethos of this show, is like trying to figure that out. That's a big part of why I'm interested in reading all of this stuff for the show, is because I want to know how things happened previously. I want to know what worked and what didn't. And I want to understand better how modernity is going to change the adaptations of that form. You know, that was a weird way to say that, but like, it's not 1917 and the United States isn't Russia.
Right.
And so like, as much as like I love to read about the Russian Revolution, and see tiny little glimmers of hope for the future of humanity in the Western world. I mean, across the globe, but, I'm saying from my vantage in the Western world,
right.
I know that, like, it's not a one-to-one kind of application.
Yeah.
And so that's an important question. I don't know how anyone could read these books in the modern day and not have that on the top of their mind.
Yeah. Well, I think it's distinctly important. Stalin talks a lot about the ways in which Russia's situation was unique, the ways in which Russia's situation allowed the revolution to happen. I mean, specifically, heck, I have a quote. I was trying not to jump around here, but...
Fuck it.
Yeah, we're slapping this shit up.
We love a quote.
All right, yeah. So on 165, he actually even says... Still less reason is there for denying the colossal importance of the fact that the principal groups of imperialists were engaged in a deadly war during the period of the October Revolution, when the imperialists engrossed in war amongst themselves were unable to concentrate their forces against the young Soviet power and the proletariat. This is the reason that the organization was able to happen. It's important to think about the context of the situation, the era that they're in, because if you were to try and follow this exact experience... aside from all the obvious ridiculous things, what would you try to do? Engineer a global war for then your side to lose? I mean, Lenin advocates for a revolutionary defeatism, right? But I'm not going to go out of my way to not whatever I could do. I'm not going to fucking press the big red button myself, but I'm not going to support war because I then want us to lose.
That's
I'm not
accelerationist.
Yeah, I'm not clamoring for World War III because then I think, oh, my revolutionary organization can do something.
Yeah.
Maybe if we had some kind of organized structure, but we're so far removed from that point. We're so far removed from the decisive battle, as Lenin says, that it would be absolutely absurd to think of that kind of thing. We're so far out of that situation. But it's just important. So the context is there, yet again. We read this in the context of history, y'all.
Yeah, Stalin brings it up quite a bit in here about how one of the preconditions for what happened in Russia was World War I, essentially.
Absolutely.
It never would have happened without that creating a certain amount of unrest and creating a kind of an opportunity, like a weakness in the Czarist regime.
So many
what do you
things.
fucking call it?
I mean, even on top of that, it allowed the opportunity for the Second International to be dislodged, essentially. They essentially had the seat of power for socialism, right, up until the Bolsheviks took power. And so their actions in World War I allowed them to be judged by their deeds instead of by their words, Mm-hmm. And so I think that everything about the situation has to do with World War I, and it's a big part of the Soviets' historical analysis as well. I mean, there's a whole section where they talk about the world being caught up in the maelstrom, and it's no matter which way you look at it, Lenin was right. Whether it's the context of the maelstrom of World War I or later the context of the maelstrom of World War II, or even after that, the decolonial struggle. I mean, they were spot on some of these things, man. I was actually looking at 122.
I wrote, he was right at the bottom of this page.
Lenin was right. I wrote it right the fuck there, dude. Yeah, exactly. The West European capitalist countries will consummate their development towards socialism, not by the even maturing of socialism in them, but by the exploitation of some countries by others, by the exploitation of the first of the countries to be vanquished in imperialist war, combined with the exploitation of the whole of the East. On the other hand, precisely as a result of the first imperialist war, the East has definitely come into the revolutionary movement, has been definitely drawn into the general maelstrom of the world revolutionary movement. And it's this guy was 50 fucking years out and he had it down pat. I mean, even, any timeline that you're looking at from the context of what Lenin just said, he is correct.
Yep.
It's how scientific of his socialism.
Lenin was right.
Yeah, Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, actually, kind of related to that, I had a thought based on something that Stalin said a couple of pages earlier on 120. He's talking through these three theses, which are all boiling down to imperialism, essentially. But he says, hence the third conclusion, that under imperialism, wars cannot be averted, and that a coalition between the proletarian revolution in Europe and the colonial revolution in the East and a unified world front of revolution against the world front of imperialism is inevitable. And I was thinking a lot about that inevitability.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm mischaracterizing his point, and it's flying by me, and I'm thinking of something else instead. But I was really thinking about that with the benefit of hindsight. I'm thinking about World War II. I'm thinking about Vietnam, and cases where we are caught up in a large imperialist war. I guess when I read what Stalin is saying there, I'm reading this as we're going to see the proletarian peoples of the world, even if not united, in unison revolting against the kind of imperialist regime that has put them in such danger by engaging in imperialist war like this.
Sure.
World War II, I don't think that that's the case. I don't think we didn't see that happen in World War II. And I think maybe even more appropriately, Vietnam. There was clearly a very strong anti-war movement against Vietnam, not only in the United States, but also in Europe. We saw the coalition of the New Left happening, or on all of that stuff kind of happening concurrently, yet it all fizzled out and nothing ever came of it. And I don't know, I'm not sure how much water that argument holds.
Yeah.
I think, obviously, World War I was a precondition for what happened in Russia, and I think Stalin was expanding that, saying, like, as this continues, these wars are going to escalate, they're going to grow grander and grander with the exploitation of, what did you say, the smaller countries, by the second countries by the first or whatever? I don't know what's the most appropriate way to say that, but I think he's seeing that as a possibility, and I'm looking back and saying, like, I don't think so, though.
Yeah, I see. That's the thing, is that we're operating with hindsight. That's totally clear. But I think more so to me what Stalin is saying is that there's an inevitable resolution of the contradictions that are building up in the world. And when I think about World War I, that's always how it was taught. It's like all of these different alliances, and when one snapped, it caused all of them to basically snap. They all kicked in at once.
Actual domino theory?
No joke, dude. But yeah, I mean, I've been wrestling a lot with great man theory recently because I've been thinking about, when you think about the narrative of World War II, there's so many decisions that are made by such a small amount of people. So many countries that seem to be helmed by one person, and I know that there's so many layers of people and bureaucracy and things underneath them that it's so absurd to think about.
But when one person makes the call, presses the button, then...
it's in the context of Yugoslavia, right? How can you say really that one man held a country together for 40 years? Is that not offensive to everything else that country did?
Sure.
Right? I'm happy to give Tito his roses or whatever, but it's like, it seems a little crazy. The thing is that I can't just chalk World War II up to Hitler. That's the thing, right? There are also so many other things that were happening around the world. The Sino-Japanese conflict was going down. The Spanish Civil War was happening with Franco. There's so many things that it does also seem inevitable. And inevitable, I think, is a little bit misleading because we're not saying like World War II, exactly as it went down, had to go down that way because of XYZ, all the stars aligned, bing, bang, bop. We dropped 2 nukes. What I'm saying, though, is that there was a resolution to the contradictions piling up that had to happen, one way or the other.
Yeah, I think inevitable often implies passivity, and that's not an appropriate
People were actively trying to make their own history, and all of those activities together caused what then we knew as World War II, Because there's so many things, like when you think about World War II as a section of time, right? Where do you start it and end it? Do you start it with the invasion of Poland? Do you start it years earlier, right? Do you start it with the rise of the Nazis? Do you start it with Mussolini inventing fascism? Like where do you draw the line, right? Especially with this beginning of the war. And so I just think that it goes back to the historical context of it, I think that when Stalin talks about the inevitability, he's just saying that, like, the shit's going to pop off, The shit's going to hit the fan at some point.
You can only get so close to the edge before you're going to fall over. Yeah.
And I think we see that cycle repeat. I mean, everything that happened in Vietnam was really the crowning moment of this kind of anti-colonial thing, Like, Vietnam was so effective at telling the French to fuck off that they got the biggest colonial power involved, and then they told those guys to fuck off too. It's the resolution of the contradiction between a people that need to be liberated and a system that requires domination.
Well said.
And I'm so sorry, we're doing it again right now. We're about to see it happen again when it comes to Iran and Israel. I mean, there are so many contradictions that are piling up in the world today. It's hard not to say the same thing. It's hard not to say, like, it seems inevitable that there will be some kind of large-scale conflict that will be the resolution of all these contradictions. Whether that is, the existence of an apartheid ethno-state in the Middle East, whether that's the border conflict between Pakistan and India. There's a lot of things that are still unresolved, and that resolution is going to be tremendous.
Yeah, tremendous. That's an understatement.
Yeah. I didn't want to say great, but it will be massive.
Yeah, in its size, not in a moral judgment.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
okay,
that's just kind of where I felt on that one. I do see what you're saying about hindsight being 2020.
Yeah, and I guess maybe unconsciously I am thinking of it through the literal moment right now, as we've read this over the last couple of weeks, watching the escalation happen there, and at the same time watching the escalation here domestically, and seeing Marines like arrest an American citizen.
How far can that go, you know?
Yeah.
How far can that go? Especially because we're in a situation right now where there's no organized structure. There's no organization there that can push back against it, right? The biggest organization that can do it is so heavily co-opted. I mean, the Democratic Party, you know, that it's like, what's the fucking point?
If only there were some sort of organized party.
An organized and disciplined massive group of people. It doesn't even need to be the majority, in fact. You know, no critical mass. It just needs to be, I don't know, maybe a leader of some sort, maybe like we need to kind of guard our gains, maybe a vanguard. Just saying. So,
and I don't know that we can move off that.
Well, yeah, I mean, we will talk about the party. I mean, that's going to be a big part of this here.
Yeah, if we're going kind of in order, this is a silly thing, but I did just want to call it a quote on 126. Just a quick trot shot. Because Lenin proposed that the revolution be crowned with the transfer of power to the proletariat, whereas the adherents of permanent revolution wanted to begin at once with the establishment of the power of the proletariat, failing to realize that in so doing they were closing their eyes to such a minor detail as the survivals of serfdom, and were leaving out of account so important a force as the Russian peasantry, failing to understand that such a policy could only retard the winning of the peasantry over to the side of the proletariat. That is a thing that a year ago wouldn't have made any sense to me.
Yeah, what are you talking about?
But I love it now.
I mean, it's interesting because it's not that, like, when we talk about permanent, I even love it actually at the top of 126 when he says the permanent, and then in parentheses, uninterrupted. Because when we read Permanent Revolution, I remember saying, like, permanent doesn't really make sense here. You know, we're really talking about, like, a continuous thing.
Yeah.
And I kind of have to give it to Stalin because what he says is, like, yeah, we're looking for permanency too, just like fuck whatever y'all are saying. You know, it's like Marx even talks about permanency in the same way.
Yeah.
Like of a continuous revolution. In fact, I love on 127 when he says, Marx proposed only that the revolution be crowned with the establishment of proletarian state power by hurling, step by step, one section of the bourgeoisie after another from the heights of power.
Yeah.
Just chucking them.
Yeah. In taking it from Marx, our permanentists altered it somewhat, and in altering it, spoilt it and made it unfit for practical use.
Oh, gosh.
That does kind of open a question. So I'm an idiot. That's well established on the show. I do not have a strong historical context. The only history of the USSR I've ever learned was the propagandized version that I was spoon-fed in high school. So I know very little, but I was thinking a lot about socialism in one country while reading this. And I was really looking for Stalin to give me some strong arguments for why it's necessary or how it's necessary. Yeah. And I was surprised to find that I think he's very strongly advocating for a strong socialist core in a country that then uses its resources to support proletarian revolution elsewhere.
Yeah.
Which sounds counter to every criticism that I hear about Stalin's socialism in one country ethos. And I have a bunch of stuff we can point to if you think there's fruit on that tree.
Yeah, I think there is a couple of things as well, because I had some thoughts about that also. That surprised me as well, is that there is a very strong internationalist current in this book. And reminder that this is from 1924.
1924, yeah.
You know, 1924. I'll say that again, right? That was a nice surprise. And it's so funny to me because it's like socialism for one country is like a backronym, you know, like they're like, we have to fucking do this, you know, clearly the rest of the world isn't going to revolt. So like, I guess we're doing socialism in one country now, you know, it's not that they didn't still have world revolution on the mind. You know, it's not that they said like, it wasn't so like self-isolating that socialism in one country makes it sound like.
Yeah.
So I was really, I was quite pleased to see Stalin be like, you know, because he even says here when he's talking about self-determination, you know, they talk a lot about the national question in this, and he says, pronouncements about the, quote, equality of nations, unquote, not backed by the direct support of the proletarian parties for the liberation struggle of the oppressed nations are meaningless and false. You know, and it's just like, yeah, back up your words with actions, you know?
Yeah. Well, and kind of to the point you made earlier about actions, not slogans, he calls that out a couple of times. And right above what you just read there, he writes, Leninism brought the national question down from the lofty heights of high-sounding declarations to solid ground.
Right. There is something to be said about, there's a little bit of pragmatism in here, you know? When he talks about sometimes it actually might not be worth supporting the self-determination of a people. Mm-hmm. You know, like, it's so funny when he says that Marx thinks of Czechs and Slovaks as reactionary peoples. Sorry to all our listeners in Czechia, but you guys are reactionary, apparently. You know, but that's the thing, right? Bringing it down from that lofty ideal, just saying like, oh, all men are equal, all countries are valid, you know, all peoples or whatever. It's like, let's actually look at the situation, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's so interesting, too, because the people don't know what they want, is what I was thinking there, right? If you're just going to say everyone has the right to self-determination, what does that right actually mean? You know, something that Stalin says here is that for some countries, it's the right of federation, where some countries, it's the right of annexation. Mm-hmm. You know, a small country might say, no, we don't want to be alone. We want to be part of your economy. Whereas a large country might say, like, you are separate. You know, you're free. You don't have to be part of us. In a lot of determinative struggles of people, it's typically a minority peoples that are oppressed by a country. Mm-hmm. But it's weird to think about minority peoples that are like brought into the country, you know? When we think about the Soviet Union, there were hundreds of different kinds of peoples there. I mean, to think about Stalin's ethnic deportations, you know, part of the Chechenian conflict in the 90s was that in the 40s, Stalin had every Chechenian removed.
Yeah.
You know, everyone. So, you know, what does it really mean for something to be self-determinative? What Stalin is saying is that there's a much more practical answer. You know, it's not just to say you're free to do what you want, go talk amongst yourselves, however you define your people, and then we'll give you your people's nation, you know, Peoplelandia. But there is room for a self-determinative ideal.
Yeah, but root your action in the material world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I have a quote here from 128, actually kind of two I'm going to weave together, if I may.
Sure.
With regard to that kind of internationalist bent, I was happy to see it in this work. He writes near the top, to proceed formerly, the victory of the revolution in one country was considered impossible on the assumption that it would require the combined action of the proletarians of all or at least a majority of the advanced countries to achieve victory over the bourgeoisie. Now this point of view no longer fits in with the facts. And he continues on a little further down that paragraph to say all of this leads not only to the possibility, but also to the necessity of the victory of the proletariat in individual countries. Okay, so yeah, he's saying that historically, before the revolution in Russia, it was thought you're never going to be able to do that without the aid of other proletarians in other countries. But he said, we did it, so that was proven false. And that continues on that now it's not a fair assumption to say then that because that happened in Russia, it has to happen that way elsewhere, because he continues on 129. So I'm really leaning heavy into the quotes this episode, but does this mean that it will thereby achieve the complete and final victory of socialism, i.e. does it mean that with the forces of only one country, it can finally consolidate socialism and fully guarantee that country against intervention, and consequently also against restoration? No, it does not. For this, the victory of the revolution in at least several countries is needed. Therefore, the development and support of revolution in other countries is an essential task of the victorious revolution. And again, I was very happy to hear that, because he is suggesting that my whole deal when we read Permanent Revolution was, how do you sustain a revolution and move it forward in one country when you have this constant onslaught from surrounding countries globally trying to take you down? That will never happen. That's why I was saying like something like a permanent revolution makes sense theoretically, because you need support. You need to keep growing that so your numbers can bulwark against that kind of outside intervention. Mm-hmm. And it's nice to hear him say, like, once you have achieved some form of power in one country, then it is paramount to support similar proletarian revolutions globally to help exactly that, have a victorious global internationalist revolution.
Yeah, it comes back down to alliances. You know, when he talks about the peasant question, he says that the question is really like, what allies are reasonable to have? You know, what allies do we need? And in the same way, he talks about the necessity of allying the liberation movement when there's revolutionary potential within it. And I love this idea, too, because I'm actually looking at 137 here, Because he talks about a peaceful path of development to socialism. Like, yeah, actually, it is possible to reform capitalism into socialism. It just has to be a capitalist country that's completely encircled. It's like reform to socialism or be obliterated, you know? I love that.
It's peaceful under threat.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's like voluntarily make a substantial concession to the proletariat.
Exactly.
Really nice. I'm thinking about judging someone on their words versus their deeds, and it's Stalin. Like, this is good theory.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is good theory. There's a lot that he says in here about the revolution that I love. There's a lot that he says about the party that I really appreciated. It was clarifying and contextual, you know, and I'm just trying to square that with Stalin's actions. You know, to what extent are they in line with what he's writing here? To what extent are they antithetical? I don't have the answer to that question right now, but it's just something that's going to be on my mind until we get a broader picture of Stalin.
Yeah, I'll say it again. I'm really looking forward to learning more about Stalin. I really want to read that Lasordo.
Yeah.
Because I have no real context. I know that there were other proletarian movements globally that looked to Stalin very favorably. I don't know. I want to know more about that.
Yeah, same here. I've got a lot of books to read to get up to that point. I wish I had read more books for this one as well, but I didn't realize it until after the fact.
There's always too much to read.
I know. But just when it comes to the context of like the Soviet political structure and whatnot, I think it would have really been helpful to have here. I still got some of that.
I will say there is the section where he goes on about the Soviets and how the reason they do it is because it's the best possible form. I'm like, okay, yeah. I don't know what to say to that.
Well, I think that the way that the Soviets are structured, the way that the Soviet government, the word Soviet itself, I think is hugely misleading. Because all they're talking about is essentially like meeting organizations, you know, councils. Mm-hmm. Maybe not councils in exactly the way that most people think, but that's all a Soviet is. It's a body of delegates, essentially. And if you were to set out and say, I want the most representative government possible, this is probably the kind of thing that you would come up with. Because all they did was they had organizations, which were, at first at least, formed around industries. And then they had all of those organizations send delegates up to further committees, higher up the chain until they hit to the very top. It's not anything crazy. It's just that you send your delegates up the chain until you're at the part of the organization that makes the serious movement, you know, and they're relaying it all the way up. Much in the same way, any delegate that you send up, you could instantly recall, right? You could say, you aren't following our will, you aren't representative of us, you're out of there.
Yoink.
Seems pretty ideal.
That's what people think of when they think of democracy.
Yeah, right? And even when we think about, I know we don't have a firm definition of what council communism is, but if we go and read the Council Communist Reader or whatever, and it says, have a series of councils where you send a delegate up the council, I don't know how I'm going to feel. I'm going to be kind of mad, if I'm being honest, because it's like, hey, fellas, hate to break it to you, but this has kind of been tried, you know? And I know that there might be some discrepancies there with, like, who leads the party or whatever, but how different really is your ideal structure to what they sincerely attempted, you know? And even if you want to say Stalin degenerated that worker state all the way down or whatever, right now we're talking about under the Lenin Constitution. I guess at this point they had declared no opposition allowed. Lenin said no more opposition, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I need to figure it out, right? Even if I'm willing to say in 1937 or whatever, 1932, when the Stalin Constitution happens, probably later 30s, things changed for the worse. Until that point, they were operating under the most representative structure of government that they could conceive of, basing it on the Soviets. So what do you want? You know, what do you want?
What more do you want?
That's kind of where I'm at. So many people, I think, don't have a fucking clue what they're talking about. We barely have a clue what we're talking about. And even then, like,
I think we've got a clue between us.
Yeah, with maybe one clue. With my limited, investigation, there's already so many more questions than I have received answers.
For sure.
You know?
Yeah.
And I just think that it's really important. If you want to go against the party because of the actions of the Soviet Union, I need you to be a little more specific. And I know we're riding hard for the party this episode, but it's only because we haven't gotten to the part where Stalin talks about the party yet.
You want to jump into that?
I think we might want to.
I think we jump to the party.
Yeah, I think let's get to the meat and potatoes. Or, sorry, the...
Protein and potatoes?
Protein implies meat, Aaron. I hate to break it to you.
Protein is in all sorts of shit.
Listen, buddy,
I have been very fastidiously tracking my macros for the last 4 months. As I
Listen, I understand
30 pounds, by the way.
I understand scientifically what protein is. Thank you. But if people say, what's my protein for dinner? They're talking about meat, dude.
Well, I would say no omnivore is going to say protein for dinner. I think that's an herbivore thing to say.
I would disagree with you because I have done it myself. Okay.
But yeah, whatever.
Yeah, anyway, let's get to the
main course.
I need the main course. There we go. Yes. We read this because we wanted to talk about the party.
Yeah.
Stalin has some serious things to say about the party. I think that the most interesting thing about it is how deeply integrated he wants the party to be. Like, at the same time, a party is a detached body that is leading the proletariat, but it's also one that's integrated. A lot of left-com issues that I've heard about the party is that putting yourself as a representative of the proletariat necessarily creates you as a separate body.
Separates you from it, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Right? It detaches you. And I didn't want to say detached because he literally says that it's detached here. To what extent is that detachment an issue? I don't know. Like, to Stalin, there's no issue at all. How massive can the party be? Can the party include everybody? Clearly not, because Stalin says purge them all out, get rid of the ones that don't matter. Yeah. But if we're just going to purge everybody that disagrees, what are you going to end up with here?
Well, that feels a little flippant to say purge anyone that disagrees.
Well, brother, I mean, he says even we shouldn't even try to reason with them. We shouldn't try to convert them. We should just get rid of them.
Yes, he does advocate for purges at a certain point, and I think... I don't know. I feel like we skipped over the party part and we're jumping right to the purge part.
Well, maybe let's take a step back from purges then. So we're talking about the party structure.
Yeah.
We want it to be massive. We want it to be at the head of the body of people. We want it to lead. But to what extent is being a representative party something that's so separatory that it is spoiling the broth? Ugh, didn't want another meal.
Spoil the broth.
Yeah.
Well, shit. He even has a quote specifically where he calls out people's criticisms of the party as being bureaucratic and like kind of sluggish.
Yeah.
On 180, the principle of the minority submitting to the majority, the principle of directing party work from a center, capital P, party work from a center, not infrequently gives rise to attacks on the part of wavering elements to accusations of bureaucracy, formalism, etc. So he brings that up as a criticism, and then he asks on the next page at the bottom of 181, but how can a single leadership be exercised with such an abundance of organizations? What guarantee is there that this multiplicity of organizations will not lead to divergency in leadership? Mm-hmm. That's kind of the question. How large can the party be while avoiding bureaucracy, but also while maintaining the party line? The larger you grow with separate organizations and bodies within the mass of the party, the harder and harder it becomes to keep that kind of ironclad discipline.
Yeah, here's the thing, and it's the party is meant to be representative of the people. The Leninist argument, from what I understand, that gives the party its legitimacy over other forms of democracy is that in a normal democracy, we are already used to subordinating the will of the majority to the minority, right? It's just that in that sense, what's happening is that it's a class domination, right? In class society, the minority is dominating the majority. So I guess in the sense, then, the party has to be at least a majority. If it's going to be the ruling body, then it needs to be a reflection of the majority onto the minority. Like, we're willing to accept that level of authority because all of these organizations are serving one class, which is the majority class, right? Which he actually says there. It is also true all these organizations should work in one direction. They serve one class of the proletarians. Although he does say on the next page, it's not to say that non-party organizations are subordinated officially.
Yeah, because he even asks who is to determine that line,
right?
The party line.
It's just that in the organization, in the cooperative organization of those workplaces, party members should be present. And I think it's interesting, something to be said, and this is reflected in history, is that they were basing it off of industry, right? They were basing it off of work, off of labor, not off of territory. Although later on, Soviets were created for cities specifically, initially they were not. They might have been banned. They wanted to expressly boost the political power, essentially, of the working class, and they did that through the structure of their elections. I mean, we didn't really talk about the idea of the peasantry, but like the peasants were a majority of the population, and the structure of Soviet government was in such a way that the peasants' voice was essentially minimized, unless they were pulled into the same body as the proletariat. So it's just really interesting because you can say that the Soviet electoral system was an earnest attempt to put the working people in charge in the most representative democracy, and they were only able to do that with the discipline of the party.
No, I mean, but the question of like, how can you be a representation of the people and be separated from the people? That's the root question that we're exploring here.
Yeah.
And I think the answer is like, there just needs to be some mechanism for accountability. That seems like a simple solution. Advocates for representative quote unquote democracy like we have in the United States would argue that like your ability to elect the officials that are the ones making decisions for you is your means of making sure that your needs and desires are being met and addressed and met.
Sure.
It's obviously broken and doesn't work that way because we live in a plutocracy, not an actual democracy. But if in the, your description of the Soviet system, the way that it worked, and that someone is recallable at a moment's notice, if the people whom they are representing feel as though they are not being represented, then yes, you are separate because there's like a pragmatism to the need to do that. You can't call tens of thousands of people from one space in your country to like some national conference of every citizen and take a vote. We know what happens with that. That is where things slow down and shut down. I was thinking about the Paris Commune so much while reading this.
Totally.
And so like the need for that the efficiency of a representative that is separated but representative of the people, I think is very reasonable.
Yeah.
There just needs to be a protected mechanism for making those people accountable. The question of if that continued on in the history of the USSR is one that people can answer for themselves. But
that's what I was just about to say, is that even the measures of accountability that the Soviets put into place, I think they came with their own problems. I mean, just for complete transparency, all of the information I am pulling from comes from one video by Noj Rants, N-O-J, on YouTube, literally like a week ago as of today, about how the Soviet elections actually worked under Lenin. And there were a lot of issues with the way that, first off, the biggest issue was that not everyone participated.
Yeah.
I really am appreciative of the way Stalin and also Lenin in this talk about imbuing the people with the power to lead, the knowledge to be able to actually take part in society. It's like how people talk about an educated vote or an uneducated voter. Some people say, like, I'd rather have people not vote than make an uneducated vote. This feels in the same vein to me, I should say. Because if every single person in the U.S. was suddenly involved in the political process, we would have absolute fucking chaos, But the thing is that we want everyone to be involved, It's just that there are steps in between where we are now and that, full participation, and it's to the sense where, like, what does that participation even mean? I mean, I think that's kind of this almost transcendent attitude to democracy that a lot of these communist writers have, and it's because they're thinking about a society in which not everyone needs to participate to still reflect the will of the masses. Where we might talk about a primitive democracy or a perfect democracy or whatever, it's because we want as much participation as possible to get as accurate of a reflection as possible. But I think that the flippancy that the communists have is because they don't feel that same need. They say if everyone's taken care of and everyone's needs are there, then what participation do we really need?
Yeah.
We've empowered everyone that needs to be empowered through the party. There can be a minority there because the majority is in power. The majority class is in power.
yes, I just had a question in my mind about participation that I guess I'd never really thought of before. This seems really kind of naive or short-sighted, I guess, but the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat being the majority subjugating the minority. But if not everybody is participating, how can you ever be sure that you are actually a majority subjugating the minority? That does kind of imply with it like a 100% participation. Otherwise, How are you certain you have a majority of the will being implemented there?
I don't know. I think it comes from class analysis, probably.
Yeah.
That's the basis in which a big method that the Soviets used was disenfranchisement, right? In order to make sure that the people who voted, they were reflecting the majority of people, meaning the proletariat. They literally disenfranchised people who, like, owned land, They disenfranchised people who, like, had business connections, who had capital gains, right? Who didn't...
Petty bourgeois.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In the same way that they disenfranchised peasants. So, like, they had those structures built into the system. The effectiveness of that I can't comment on, but it's not that it isn't possible, even if you don't have 100% participation. Because that's the thing. If everyone voted today, we would have anarchy tomorrow, okay? Like, that, I feel that confidently. Because it's median voter politics again. Every American is a centrist, and it's because all of their beliefs are so crazy in every direction that it ultimately averages out. So if we're talking about empowering people to lead, that comes with it a certain standard. Then we're basing that standard essentially on the dictatorship of the proletariat. We're basing it on a class analysis. Mm-hmm. And also, when we're talking about the alliances that have revolutionary potential, like the peasantry, for example, they don't talk about leaving those people as peasants. They talk about bringing them into the proletariat. Yep. In our alliance, they are also being changed.
Yep. Word.
Hell yeah.
I have at least one other quote about the party that I wanted to pull. Though, I mean, I don't really want to sell it short because I think this section is interesting, and it is largely framed as a polemic against the Second International's attitude toward parliamentarism.
Yeah.
And I think he has some good things to say about that. But the quote that stood out to me, I guess the most, comes from 183. Stalin writes, "It scarcely needs proof that without a party capable of rallying around itself the mass organizations of the proletariat and of centralizing the leadership of the entire movement during the progress of the struggle, the proletariat in Russia could not have established its revolutionary dictatorship. But the proletariat needs the party not only to achieve that dictatorship, it needs it still more to maintain the dictatorship, to consolidate and expand it in order to achieve the complete victory of socialism." And this is an encapsulation of really the point I've made every single time we've talked about the party, which is the reason I am still in favor of the party is because it needs a mechanism to maintain itself, to defend itself, to move forward. Yeah. I am all for some sort of collective action or whatever. I like the idea of democracy. I'm down with all of that, right? But like, there has to be a mechanism that not only creates a revolution, starts a revolution, I should say, but maintains that revolution and works to expand the revolution. Without an organized body, I don't see that happening.
It goes back to that problem we talked about so long ago, about the militia. Creating a militia creates a separation, whether it's armed or not. In what ways can you organize self-defense that do not also create a centralized authority if the goal is not to have centralized authority? Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. Like, I've been kind of softening on this recently, and it's because there's assumptions in the question that you couldn't defend yourself collectively without some kind of central organization, and that's what I'm trying to wrangle with here. If everyone was armed and knew to act in self-defense, could they survive? Probably not. That might be the collective solution that an anarchist puts up. So in that case, it means we're talking about developing some kind of organized structure for self-defense, i.e. a militia, and that brings with it its own level of hierarchy. I mean, that brings with it its own thing. If you need a militia, first off, if we're talking about something that's not guerrilla warfare, that means like serious training, and training requires organization. It requires structure. It requires centralization to some degree. Not to talk shit about the anarchists, but that was a big issue during the Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, is that the anarchists had very poor training. One, they didn't really have people that could train them in the same way, and two, they were out doing their own thing, Not to say that they didn't have organization, but they were just horribly organized in comparison to the other forces at play here, and it's part of the reason that they didn't survive, among many other things. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, like, if you're going to create something that is capable of maintaining yourself, how are you going to do that without creating the same kinds of problems of centralization that you would otherwise think? And if you're a partyist like us, then it's like, okay, no problem, because the party, within the party comes with it the discipline necessary to organize something that could feasibly defend itself. And it's a question that only gets worse as we get more advanced technologically. To think about what it would require to wage war, in air quotes, on today's society, it would be immense.
Yep.
The reason I had such a pause there, because I had the thought that it would have to be decentralized in order to not get caught. But it's not that it's decentralized, right? It's more so that it's compartmentalized. It has to be disconnected so that the ultimate forces of power in the government couldn't just pull one leg out and have the whole structure fall down. But it's not to say that it wouldn't be central. It would still have to be organized in a capacity to maintain itself.
Yeah, I mean, I that's the weakness, I guess, of the party, capital P party, is that once you have the party, the vanguard, let's even say a leader of the party, then you have a target. And it's very easy to, like you said, cut the legs out. I saw a quote from Fred Hampton recently that I'd never seen before, talking about, they jailed Huey, they jailed Bobby, they ran this guy out, but like the Black Panther Party, under a Maoist tradition, is organizing the group so much so that anytime one head gets chopped off, another is ready to rise to the ranks. And I think that that's really powerful. It's like the same sort of idea that there is not a person without which the whole thing crumbles. There is organization that allows the kind of lifting of the necessary means. And reading Blood in My Eye and George Jackson, is very much an advocate for guerrilla warfare, urban guerrilla warfare. And a party platform with the headquarters and shit is obviously a disadvantage in the case like that, but you do still need some form of underground organization to make those actions meaningful that doesn't necessarily open you up to the vulnerabilities that someone might lob as criticism.
What I was going to say, I don't remember what Lenin it was, but there's one where he addresses this criticism directly, and he says 12 comrades versus 100 fools or whatever, and it's like the 12 comrades are easier to shoot down, says 100 fools, you know? And it's like it's the exact same thing, the person is not what's important, the position is there because it's part of the party organization. If those shoes can still be filled by fresh new cadre, then whatever, right? Centralized does not necessarily mean I don't know how to phrase that, but there's something in centralization that doesn't necessarily reflect this weakness. I don't know.
Agreed. Yeah, I would agree with that. However, that does, to Stalin, he starts transitioning to talking about factions.
Yes.
Which gets him on to talking about purges.
Purge. Wow. Well, okay, one thing I do want to say, though, is that...
Okay, sorry.
Here's a positive note about the party on 184 is that he says, hey, when the state withers away, the party will too.
So too will the party,
yeah. The party will too. And that makes sense if you think of the party as the state, as the organization of one class against another. If the party is the representation of that organization, then it makes sense that it would wither away as well.
Yeah, and we've addressed this before on the show too, and I think that is thinking about the withering away of the state and like the argument that you hear a lot of people on the internet making about socialist projects in the past and about how they effectively revert to state capitalism or become something bastardized, revisionist thing.
Sure.
And argue that the state will just continue to grow into a bigger and bigger bloated thing until it is it's never going to wither away. It's just going to get bigger and bigger and worse and worse. And what we'd mentioned before on the show is like, well, maybe we just haven't seen enough of that in history. Like, I still have the question, like, how long before the withering begins? I know that Lenin says it'll take multiple generations, so there's that. I don't know enough about China to talk about it.
Dude, yeah.
But, like, I'm thinking about that when he says the party will wither away with the state.
Yeah.
And it's like, I like to believe that to be true.
Well,
and if we think of the party as the state, it almost feels more possible.
That's what I was just about to say. I've just had, like, 3 roads cross in my mind. And it's got to do, again, with that full participation. If everyone is a party member, then is anyone a party member? You know what I mean? Like, if everyone is a member of the party, then is there any need for the party? In the same way. I mean, like, if it's just assumed that you're a member of the party, and not in the same way that Stalin critiques in here, where it's just saying that any strike member could be a party member. If everyone is, like, legitimately part of this organization, part of this comradely lockstep even, then... does the party still exist in the same way? Because that's the other question I had just now is like, what is the plan for China? That was something I said earlier when I was reading this to myself. Sorry. That's a thought I had. Fuck all of that. That's a thought I had. Clearly the party is not inherent to communism because you can have capitalism with a party, i.e. China, right? And that's not a judgment call on China's socialism, whatever. It's just to say they clearly have capitalism and a party still. And the question I had was, what is the end goal for China? What is their long-term plan really? If they intend to build socialism, how are they going to do that? What does that look like? And that's when it comes to that full participation, right? If everyone in China is used to dealing with the party, even if they're not a member of the party, then if every man has to be like Mao, then Mao is the only man a man can be. No, I just think it comes back down to that full participation thing. That's what it is. Expansion is not necessarily the opposite of withering away. That's the point I had here. If something is so expanded, right, to the point where it is omnipresent, it could still wither away in the sense that its power would lose its same meaning. The powers of the state that aren't just administrative, the powers that we associate the state with of oppression, those are the powers that Lenin says will wither away, and that kind of thing could happen in the context of a party that has grown to the extent where it has a full participation. Where everyone operates within the structure of the party, not in a unity of thought, but in a unity of action, a unity of will. That's what I'm saying, right? It's not that expansion is antithetical to withering away. That's the thought I just had.
Okay. I'm going to sit on that for a while. I'm going to sit with that for a while. Think on that. But to the point of the unity of will, there is a great quote on 184. Yeah. Stalin writes, "But iron discipline in the party is inconceivable without unity of will, without complete and absolute unity of action on the part of all members of the party." But to your point of earlier, where I said, maybe that's a little flippant, right before he starts talking about factions, he does say, "On the contrary, iron discipline does not preclude, but presupposes criticism and conflict of opinion within the party." And then he definitely draws the Leninist line of difference of opinion, unity of action kind of thing. At the top of 185, "Unity of will and unity of action of all party members are the necessary conditions without which neither party unity nor iron discipline in the party is conceivable." So he's talking there. I kind of skipped the section there where he's talking about it. But he is saying, there is a time, I guess this is kind of Maoist too, there is a time and place to debate on what is the correct course of action. But then once the determination is made, that's the determination. We don't continue to debate it. We don't continue to factionalize and fight about that. We need a unity of action in the party. And I could see some level of discomfort with that, but mostly I'm okay with it.
There's something to that in the idea that the debate is happening all the time. The debate happens in the practice. And then when everyone comes together and makes the decision, that's when the will happens. That's the thing I've been thinking about, is that there's still room for a back and forth, but it comes from the practical experience. It comes from the attempt to apply this theory. Even in the way that they talk about the permanency of revolution, it goes back to that thing where it's asking the questions that demand socialist answers. The practice of trying to apply this, that's where all of the debate is happening. And then when they come together and decide on it, it's just deciding on what course worked the best.
Yeah. It's analysis, not decision-making.
Yeah.
Per se.
It's not that this is debate in the sense of fucking all the idiots on the internet. It's this idea of wrestling with these different applications until you as a party, as an organized group, comes together and say, we have decided on this one, and that's that's the unity that is then worked upon. And again, I understand that, so much of this relies on the idea of bottom-up democracy. Something that we're ignoring throughout this is the idea, the Western idea perhaps, that Stalin is a dictator. He just dictated all of this from above. To what extent was he really influenced from below? I know that obviously we're not the people to say that. Mm-hmm. That's not what we maybe believe. But there's a lot of assumption happening in this text that the person at the top is, in fact, listening to all the people below him. The Soviets had recall, but nobody ever recalled Stalin. He had to threaten to leave 4 times, and they kept voting him back in.
That's what I was going to say earlier. Even Trotsky voted for him the first time.
Yeah. What was he, in fucking Kazakhstan? So there's still issues with the Soviet structure, It's just it's a strange beast.
Yeah,
it's a strange beast.
Can't talk about Stalin without talking about purges.
Yes, purges, exactly. Well, he says it quite plainly on 187. In fact, he says the party becomes strong by purging itself of opportunist elements.
Yep.
A little bulimic, but hey, that's fine. I don't know. That's my big point of contention, actually. At the bottom of 186, he says, the theory of, quote, defeating opportunist elements by ideological struggle within the party. The theory of, quote, overcoming, unquote, these elements within the confines of a single party is a rotten and dangerous theory which threatens to condemn the party to paralysis and chronic infirmity. So that's kind of the thing.
Yeah, I have 2 quotes right above that, actually, that I think are valid.
Okay.
Now, I'm not here as an apologist for purges, but I do think he brings up a valid point that requires consideration. He says, in one way or another, all these petty bourgeois groups penetrate into the party and introduce into it the spirit of hesitancy and opportunism, the spirit of demoralization and uncertainty, To fight imperialism with such allies in one's rear means to put oneself in the position of being caught between two fires from the front and from the rear. And I get that. I think that's a very valid point. The trouble with that attitude is, where is the line? You've brought up this question on the show before, like, where is the line? And I don't think there's a clear answer to that. And I think that that is something that is still probably the thing that makes me uncomfortable with the capital P party as an organization, is because you do have to, the party does have to protect itself from infiltration, from opportunism. But, well, one, I guess, is, what is the cost of that? How many of your resources are going toward guarding against opportunism versus actually doing what the party is supposed to be doing? And two, where is the line that defines an opportunist?
Yeah.
That has a huge impact. There are implications.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think it goes back to when we think about purges, we're really thinking about the great purges where people were tried and then shot.
Yeah.
Okay. Stalin talks about here situations in which, at the bottom of 187, it may even be useful to remove excellent communists who are liable to waver and who reveal a tendency to waver towards unity with reformists, right? He's not saying shoot those people. He's saying...
That's Lenin even.
You're right. Happens all the time. He's not saying shoot those people, right? He's saying you're purging them from, I don't know, what, like the day-to-day rigmarole of the party?
Party affiliation.
Yeah.
Party responsibility.
I guess, but like... If purging everybody means you lose the majority, then what? That's really the main thought I have here, right? Because you can't purge everybody. That's how we end up with these like ridiculous little sects that, groups have just split off smaller and smaller until they have the most pure, perfect Gonzaloist thought, group or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like, that's clearly not the point here. So yeah, again, where do you draw the line is such a serious question. Because I don't know what the answer to that looks like. How do you determine? Is it just based on the vibe? Is it just based on a current analysis of the situation? Like, is that what we're talking about?
If we have a system in place where the people can recall their representative, there must also be a system in place where the party can recall a representative. The party is the people.
Yeah.
And so, like, if the party determines that Trotsky is an opportunist or a revisionist or a factionalist or whatever you want to call him, and so he needs to be kicked out of the party, then that's the democratic mechanism by which we're determining what defines opportunism. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In theory.
In theory.
How large is the party that is making that determination? If the party is Stalin, then, you open yourself to the problem there of it being a despot or or whatever. So
right.
I guess there's still a question.
Well,
there,
I'm just thinking about when we read, I think it was in the Rocker essay, when he says, Stalin is the one who determines whether you're a bureaucrat or not. Like, yeah, you get to make a decision if you're a bureaucrat. Who says you're a bureaucrat? Stalin. I don't know. There seems to be a disconnect in you know what there is there's a disconnect in willpower between the top and the bottom, right? And it goes back to that participation. Which process is more likely to happen? Recall from below or purge from above? I think the answer is pretty obvious because one is a more active group of people, as in they run the day-to-day political structure of the party.
That's true.
There's an imbalance of power there that I feel is kind of maybe worth addressing. Thinking back to the actual structure of the Soviet government, you see that happened quite frequently, is that people were pretty hesitant to do recall from below. And in addition, the principle of what delegates they sent forth to talk again about their development from Tsarist Russia, a lot of the village Soviets simply replicated their traditional structures, which were patriarchally driven. So how really is that representative anyway if it's just replicating the old structures?
Yeah.
So there's just some things that have to be dealt with there, and yeah, the party model could be applied maybe to today's America with the modern internet and everything, and we could do a more equitable democratic centralism, but it's just a trickier thing to build than I think we're even giving it credit for after this.
I think that's true. I'm still just trying to frame this and so what is the answer then? How do you organize a party that is protected from opportunists that isn't also consolidating power in a way that is going to expel anyone that they don't want in the party and by calling them opportunist?
I don't know. Is it possible within the confines of one party? That's the thing. And that's the problem too, because you can't add a second party. That doesn't work.
Yeah.
That defeats the purpose.
Well, and I mean, just to maybe speak more broadly on that, that's part of what I appreciate about the discourse between communists and anarchists, as an example, is that I feel that they work very well as a foil for the other. I think communists need anarchists to keep communists in check, and anarchists need communists to keep anarchists in check. Like, draw some boundaries around your ideas, says the communist, and the anarchist says, widen your boundaries around your ideas. And I think that that's part of what makes that dynamic very powerful, but that's also what grinds things to a halt when action, decisive action, needs to be taken.
You know, it's a bit of a reverse trot shot. But I think we're in between the minimum and the maximum program, unfortunately. But that's the thing. You're exactly right. You know, the boundaries can't be so wide that they're not actionable.
Yeah.
But they can't be so strict that we're concentrating power in a way that then
they can't be drawn around one person.
Yeah, that's tough.
I mean, we've been exploring this question from the very beginning, and here we are 32 episodes in, and I don't feel like we're particularly closer to an answer.
No, I don't have any other options is the problem. Anarchy, I'm clearly not satisfied with. The party, I'm clearly not satisfied with, even if it's more satisfying.
Yeah.
I don't know what other options there are. Currently, as I'm feeling, council communism seems a lot like the party minus, you know, or the party expanded, the wide party, the big tent party or something. And what else is there, right? I mean, whatever they're doing in fucking Kurdistan, that's it. If you know, if you have another form, you can let us know at leftandredfeedback@gmail.com.
So yeah, let's jump into the cavalcade of quotes.
Hell yeah.
So Stalin opens the text. After he defines Leninism, he goes to talk about the contradictions of imperialism, or what Lenin called moribund capitalism. And he gives a couple of quotes that I really like here. Starting on 104, he says, either place yourself at the mercy of capital, eke out a wretched existence as of old and sink lower and lower, or adopt a new weapon. This is the alternative imperialism puts before the vast masses of the proletariat. Well said, no notes. And then at the bottom 104 onto 105, there's this great bit where he's describing imperialism, and I just think it's such a good description of the modern world, the global south, the Nordic model. He says, imperialism is the most bare-faced exploitation and the most inhuman oppression of hundreds of millions of people inhabiting vast colonies and dependent countries. The purpose of this exploitation and of this oppression is to squeeze out super profits. But in exploiting these countries, imperialism is compelled to build their railways, factories and mills, industrial and commercial centers. The appearance of the class of proletarians, the emergence of a native intelligentsia, the awakening of national consciousness, the growth of the liberation movement, such are the inevitable results of this policy. I don't know, I mentioned the Global South and the Nordic model because I think like so much of the way the modern world has dealt with the contradictions of imperialism is to hide them from the countries committing these acts of neocolonial imperialist subjugation or whatever, and tuck them away in countries in the global south that are being heavily exploited. And we pretend like that exploitation no longer exists because we can eke out, like you said before, a reasonable existence where we're not being, the thumb of capitalism is not being pressed down on us so strongly that we're going to burst. Mm-hmm. But by doing so, the imperialists are also creating the means of their own destruction. And I fucking love that.
It's that quote, right? When it comes time to hang them, the capitalists will sell us the rope. You
Exactly.
know, they literally build up all of these structures. They create the proletariat that will then, you know, unseat them.
Yep.
And it's interesting the way that I'm thinking about how you said we hide them. When we think of all of these quote third world countries unquote, how they're portrayed is always hugely corrupt, gang ridden, all of these things, and it's like you forget that you are the one that governs, you know, to quote back to George Jackson. It's like you created these situations, you know, and we're so happy to point at like, look at this African warlord, or like look at this fucking all the gang warfare down in Colombia or whatever, and it's like, you did it, buddy.
Yep.
You did it. Like when the president of Colombia says that they should just legalize cocaine, you know, that would solve a lot of problems in the U.S. and it would also solve a lot of problems in Colombia as well. It's like, hell yeah, man. Hell yeah.
Based.
Yeah.
My next one's on 110.
Capitalism killed by legal means.
That's what it is exactly.
We are completely in line on all of these
Lockstep.
quotes, by the way. Yeah, we've been in tune on this piece.
Do you want to read that one? Do you want me to do it?
Go ahead.
At the top of 110, we get this quote. Maybe I should contextualize it a little bit. He's talking about capitalism and the relatively peaceful development of it in the pre-war period, and he says, when it was thought that capitalism would be killed by legal means, in short, when the parties of the Second International were living in clover and had no inclination to think seriously about revolution, about the dictatorship of the proletariat, about the revolutionary education of the masses. And I just thought a lot about liberals today. I'm thinking about the Democratic Party and their idea that they're going to vote their way out of fascism, or at least the narrative that they can vote their way out of fascism, which they sell to the people as a means of maintaining the status quo. I just thought that was chef's kiss.
Much in line, I'm looking on 113. Does not the history of the revolutionary movement show that the parliamentary struggle is only a school for and an auxiliary in organizing the extra parliamentary struggle of the proletariat? That under capitalism, the fundamental problems of the working class movement are solved by force, by the direct struggle of the proletarian masses, their general strike, their uprising. It's much in the same way. I'm going to jump ahead here, because we didn't really talk about the way he talks about reform, and I love the way that Stalin says it here. For one, right here, it's perfectly fine to take part in the legal means, but you need to understand that it is part of a larger operation, one that might not be wholly legal, and to jump ahead, I'm looking on 173, way deep, when he says, to a reformist, reforms are everything, while revolutionary work is something incidental, something just to talk about, mere eyewash. To a revolutionary, on the contrary, the main thing is revolutionary work and not reforms. To him, reforms are a byproduct of the revolution.
Yes, sir.
The revolutionary will accept reform in order to use it as an aid in combining legal work with illegal work and to intensify, under its cover, the illegal work for the revolutionary preparation of the masses for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. That's really what it's all about. The revolutionary work is what has to be leading, in the same way that we say the vanguard might need to lead the proletariat, right? It's not that the rest of the structure is unimportant. It's just that we have one goal in mind.
And I would argue also to that end that the action of the vanguard is what's mobilizing everybody else. I think there are a lot of people that are dissatisfied with the state of things, but maybe either don't know how to respond or due to circumstance do not feel as though they can respond. But the action of the vanguard is what lights a fire under the asses of the rest of the people to get things moving forward.
Yeah, it's the vehicle, right?
Yeah.
You might not have a place to put your energies, but by joining a party, even if you're falling into line with them, you're still lending your voice to what is essentially the mass line, just to contextualize it in the mass populace. Because when you join a party, you subordinate yourself to the mass line, but you're also part of the mass. You're part of the line that's being created. You're part of that debate.
On 135, under capitalism, the exploited masses do not, nor can they ever, really participate in governing the country, if for no other reason than that, even under the most democratic regime, under conditions of capitalism, governments are not set up by the people, but by the Rothschilds and the Stinesses, the Rockefellers, and the Morgans.
Right. I love even above that when he says that the state has to be democratic in a new way and dictatorial in a new way as well. But, I was thinking about that earlier, how representative is our democracy really? There's that study that's if your program is popular, if your policy is popular, it's got about a 30% chance of getting passed. If it's unpopular, it has about a 30% chance of getting passed. And it's because how much people care about a policy means literally nothing to its development. And it's if this were truly representative democracy, then that wouldn't be the case.
Overwhelmingly, the people support things that they've been fighting for decades and are never going to happen.
That's always been my argument about reformism. Whenever I'm talking to someone that's I'm a reformist, I think we could do this. I'm all of these things are proven, possible, and probable. We've seen their effectiveness in study. We know that they're popular with the people, and we know that it can be done because every other fucking country on this planet seems to do it. So what's stopping us?
Yep.
There's no other answer other than raw capitalism, right? Something else has power here. Something that's powerful enough to stop the majority of people from expressing their will. There's nothing representative about that.
Nope.
It's brutal. A couple of quotes about how he talks about revolution I really appreciated. First one on 128. This is actually Lenin from Left-Wing Communism. When the lower classes do not want the old way, and when the upper classes cannot carry on, only then can the revolution triumph. The revolution is impossible without a nationwide crisis. Now, the crisis I don't necessarily agree with, but it's about that inevitability that really spoke to me there. Mm-hmm. Even again on 169, when he says that the point here is not that the vanguard should realize the impossibility of preserving the old regime and the inevitability of its overthrow. The point is that the masses, the millions, should understand this inevitability and display their readiness to support the vanguard. The masses can understand this only from their own experience. It's about the people standing up. It's about the people making the decision to change their means of production. Because the people are ultimately what control it. The people are ultimately what the means of production are being controlled by on the day-to-day. So as soon as they express that will out loud, maybe through an organizational structure, that's revolution. That's the revolution. I just love that. It's the recognition of the inevitability. These things must change. And we're not just saying that for our own benefit now. In terms of the world being sustained, these things must change. As soon as the masses understand that, that will be revolution.
Hell yeah. I actually have two more. Okay. I found another one on 154. My comment on it is less about what he's saying and more about its implication.
Because of the implication.
Stalin writes, hence the necessity for the proletariat of the dominant nations to support, resolutely and actively to support, the national liberation movement of the oppressed and dependent peoples. And I was thinking a lot about the objection that you hear from people, or call it the rationalization that you hear from people a lot about, like, focus on the fight at home, this idea that you have to take care of yourself before you can help anyone else. And I think that that's usually just a deflection. I think that that's dog shit as an argument generally. And I think also we are being, as individuals in an individualist nation, being coddled into this idea of taking care of ourselves before we consider taking care of anyone else. And I think it plays into that same sort of narrative about this idea that, like, we don't have to worry about what's going on out there because we got to take care of our own shit. And while it is true that we need to take care of our own shit, that does not discount the fact that we need to support everyone else taking care of their shit. And I just appreciate that he calls that out. And it harkens back to that conversation we were having earlier in the episode about the kind of surprisingly internationalist bent of Stalin's writing here.
Yeah. You know, much in the same way that when people say, third worldist people say that, you know, revolution will never happen in the global north, part of me really hates that slogan. I sound like I'm writing a fucking polemic. Part of me really hates that slogan because it's like, that's like thought terminating. You know, it's like, oh, no revolution up there, so stop being a revolutionary. Yeah. You know, and it's like that's not the case. You should absolutely still be a revolutionary in the global north. Even if you think America will never have a revolution, you should still be an American communist because your support goes internationally. I mean, it's global. And I think that that's just so important. Like, when it comes to the potential of revolution in the global north, guess what will make it so much easier? Especially because these northern countries, globally north countries, are reliant on the global south. So the more and more of those links being taken out of the chain, the more heightened these contradictions will become, and the more imminent the resolution will be. Okay? The revolution will be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What's funny is you're bringing that up, that I have that as my question, but you just called to mind another thing that he says, and I just wanted to find it real quick.
Okay.
Because you use the metaphor of the links in the chain, and he also uses that metaphor on 121, that the theory of revolution will not necessarily happen where industry is more developed and so forth. The front of capital will be pierced where the chain of imperialism is weakest, and thus all of the other links will continue to unravel.
Yeah. There is that one part, right, where he says that the chain may break in, say, India. Why? The country has a young militant revolutionary proletariat. Shit ain't changed, brother.
Yep.
You know, it's literally 100 years later, and guess where maybe the most militant Marxism is right now? The Philippines. But India is the other one, you know. The Naxalites are there, man. They're literally fighting for Maoism. Like actual Maoism, for real Maoism. Yeah. So, you know, I'm just saying, right? This is 100 years in the past. Don't forget that. I've said it 4 times now.
Yeah.
They were right, man. They were onto something there.
That's right.
The last thing I wanted to close with, it's on the last page, 189. Fewer pompous phrases, more plain, everyday work. Less political fireworks, and more attention to the simplest but vital facts of communist construction. We're building communism. That's the point.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to talk about that or you wanted to close it with that.
No, let's, by all means.
But I mean, I think that that's such a valid point, and I think it undergirds this project, like literally this project, in that, like, communism as a methodology, communism as an ideology, whatever you want to call it, feels so impenetrable from the outside because there's so much. You have to know so much. It requires so much study. It requires so much theoretical analysis, and that's very daunting. The idea that there needs to be a way to spread communism. I know I even said, I think on the last episode, that like more and more I'm becoming like a theory gatekeeper. The more that I'm reading, the more I feel like it's necessary to read theory, where I didn't always feel that way necessarily previously. I maybe even on our first episode when we were talking about our own kind of political histories or whatever, I had said that I wouldn't say I had a radicalizing moment. I think I've always had a kind of radical idea of the way the world works, but I have read and learned more about how to articulate that through study. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I think that there's something to that. The idea that like communism is of the people. It needs to be for the people. We need to find a way to talk about it in a way that it doesn't feel like you need a fucking thesaurus, and you need to understand the nuanced intricacies of the difference between Maoism and Leninism. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like there's something impenetrable to that. And I love to hear Lenin say, fewer pompous phrases, more plain everyday work.
Yep. Roll up those sleeves, connect your blue factory suspender, your blue overalls, and slap on your newsboy hat and get down to the factory, man.
Old school lunch pail and everything.
I mean, it's just about the work, 0.0001% of true communism has ever been built. Okay, what questions did this work leave you with, Aaron?
Well, I came into this conversation with one, and I feel like there's always one underlying all of these conversations too. So I'll start. On 154, Stalin actually kind of brings it up as a question. He's talking about revolutionary potentialities in the liberation movement of oppressed countries elsewhere. He says, is there any hope, any basis for utilizing these potentialities for the proletarian revolution, for transforming the dependent and colonial countries from a reserve of the imperialist bourgeoisie into a reserve of the revolutionary proletariat, into an ally of the latter? And you'd even brought this up just a few minutes ago, talking about, like, if you believe that revolution will never happen in the global north, one way that is certainly going to make it more likely is to see revolution happen in the global south, because the global north is so dependent upon the exploitation of the global south that once the global south revolutionizes itself and we see the people taking power, we're going to see the imperialist power of the global north crumbling above it, And so it will almost accelerate the inevitability of that revolution happening elsewhere. And that really got me thinking, hearing Stalin say something very similar, ask a very similar question, like, is there revolutionary potentiality in seeing liberation movements happen globally? The answer is, of course there is. And so the question that I was left with is the support of revolutions abroad a valid approach to revolution here? And I think that's a rhetorical question. I do think the answer is yes, but the real question is, what does that look like, right? Like you said, there is value in being a revolutionary in the global north, even if you feel like in the United States revolution isn't going to happen in my lifetime, right? There's still value in being a revolutionary here. So the natural extension of that then is, how does being a revolutionary here help revolution elsewhere? Or how should my energies ever, as a revolutionary in the north, be put to abetting revolution elsewhere?
See, I think that's so interesting too, because it's even President Stalin's own answer when he talks about inter-bourgeois conflict. It doesn't have to be a revolution necessarily for it to garner your support, as long as it's something that is revolutionary. You know what I mean? I'm thinking about the axis of resistance and stuff. A lot of communists have critical support for Iran, despite the fact that it's a theocracy. And it's for that exact reason. It's because that's a preferable thing to support, even in a revolutionarily defeatist way, even outside of the Iran conflict or whatever. It's just the idea that you have to keep your mind open to liberation all over. Yeah. That might look different in different places. You know what I mean? God, communists do this all the time, especially when you look at who the Soviets supported in their foreign policy, like Assad, right, in Syria. Yeah. Not to say that he was doing pure and dandy socialism. Was he doing any socialism? I don't think that's the case, right? Yeah. But the thing is that to support him over the imperialist powers that were at play, both of the Assads, Hafez as well, not just Bashir, had its own merit to it. I'm not an Assadist by any means. I do not support.
Glad to hear it.
In the most recent Syrian conflict, who were the good guys? None of them.
Yeah, none of the above.
Zero good guys. Yeah, but that's what I mean, though. There's analysis required. It's not just a good or bad thing. It's not revolution or not revolution, right? Something could be revolutionary even if it's not revolution.
Yeah, and that's the same thing that we were talking about earlier when we were talking about looking at the materialist context in which a decision has to be made.
Right.
If your decision is between bad choice or worse choice, sometimes you got to support the bad choice. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know.
God.
There's just a reality.
Yeah. I was just thinking about how Pol Pot was propped up by the U.S. government for like 2 decades. Woohoo! Okay.
Yeah. So that's my primary question.
Yeah.
And I've been feeling especially bad about kind of not feeling like I'm doing my part. And I've been thinking about what are the ways in which I can be more activated. And this kind of struck a chord with me. Not that I'm going to fucking fly to Cuba or something like that. But, I'm thinking about those sorts of things.
Yeah, totally.
What about you?
I had a couple questions here. I always have a lot of history questions. If we're talking about epochs of history, the eras of history, kind of where do we stand now, right? On 157, actually, point D. The most important colonial independent countries have already taken the path of national liberation, which cannot but lead to the crisis of world capitalism. What happened? Yeah, I think that did happen, right? Quite a few of the most important colonial countries had a serious national liberation movement. What happened in history that prevented that from leading to a global revolution,
manifesting.
I mean, I know the answer is the CIA, among other things.
Color revolutions.
Yeah, a lot of stuff. But I'd like to know a little more, And likewise, I'd like to know a little more about the Soviet structure as well. I definitely have some Stalin legwork to do before we read Lacerda. So, but even the NEP is something that we have hardly talked about, and that's the man himself, Lenin. Like, how can we shun Deng and then be like, yeah, the NEP, right? That makes perfect sense, And I'm sure many people have made that parallel before, obviously. So, yeah, those are kind of questions on my mind. What did Stalin do to change the Soviet Union after this specifically? Like, I'm interested in the Stalin Constitution. All of those are kind of fine point questions, but that's what's on my mind.
Fair.
Why would I read this? Why did we bother to read this? Well, Will, I think I think you should read this, honestly, if you were in the position we were in. I think that this did answer some questions I had about the party, more so in that it clarified some things about the party that I had maybe assumed before. Are all of my questions about the party answered? Absolutely not. But do I have maybe some better vocabulary for asking those questions? I think, yeah.
I really need to prepare my answer for this, because I don't have a different one than you in this case. I think you should read this if you are in a similar position as us, where you feel like the best but imperfect option that you have seen in the theory so far is the capital P party, and you want to understand it better.
Yeah. As I've said before now, twice, if you have an alternative to the party and you want to let us know, as well as any other recommendations, criticism, feedback, call-outs, chit-chats, this and that, you can let us know at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. You can also follow us on TikTok, left.unread.
Yeah, do that.
That's what I had to plug. Those two. We're on YouTube.
Yeah, find the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube. Next go-round, we are going to...
We're returning. Return.
Yeah.
The continuance.
The continuance.
We're back on Capital, of course. What are we reading this time, Aaron?
Yeah, so we're reading chapters 12 to 14 of Capital. Join us, won't you?
Yeah, you definitely should. Don't get left unread.
Bye-bye.
See you.